Are you trying to figure out your gender identity? Or maybe you're just trying to figure out what all of these different labels mean? In this video, I'm going to be going through some of the most common gender identities, what they mean, and some tips to help you figure out where you might fit along the gender spectrum. Hello everyone, welcome back and happy Pride Month. My name is Maddie, and before I get into the video, I just want to take a quick moment to thank everyone who's watching this video, everyone who's subscribed to this channel. We just hit 1,000 subs on this channel, and honestly, I'm just thankful and honored and humbled that 1,000 individual people and counting stopped by this channel and said, yeah, I want to see more stuff from you. More stuff is in fact coming, so if you haven't subscribed yet, I make videos about LGBT issues and mental health, so if that sounds like your cup of tea, consider subscribing. So last summer, I uploaded a video entitled 10 Signs You Might Be Non-Binary, and in that video, the first tip I mentioned was to research non-binary identities and figure out where you might fit. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how daunting it can be to research a topic when you have no idea where to start. So since this is primarily an educational channel, I thought it might be helpful to make a video where I talk about a bunch of different non-binary identities. Now, I'm probably not going to get to every single non-binary identity. There are some that I probably haven't heard of, and there are also some that are tied to cultures that I don't belong to, so I don't really feel comfortable talking about them. But I think I wrote down like 17 different gender identities to talk about in this video, so I'm hoping that this will at least be a good starting point for your research. I've included timestamps down below if you want to skip to a specific gender identity, and with all that out of the way, let's get started. I feel like we can't really understand non-binary identities without first understanding binary identities, so let's talk about the word cisgender. Cisgender, or cis for short, refers to people who 100% identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. So if the doctor looked between your legs when you were born and said it's a boy or it's a girl, and all of your life you said, yep, that sounds about right, then you would either be a cis man or a cis woman depending on which gender you were assigned at birth. There are some people who seem to think that the words cis and cisgender are insults or slurs, but really that's not the case at all. Being cis literally just means you're not trans, and being trans just means you're not cis. Which brings me to the next gender identity on the list, which is transgender, which means that you do not 100% identify with the gender you were assigned at birth. When most people think of trans people, they think of people who were either assigned male at birth but identify as female, or people who were assigned female at birth but identify as male. And these would be binary trans people, either trans men or trans women. But there are also some trans people who don't 100% identify with either of the binary genders. In other words, they're non-binary. Now before we continue on, I'd like to address the inevitable "there are only two genders" comments that I'm going to get on this video. See, here's the thing. No. Like, even if you tried to say that gender isn't binary but sex is, you'd still be incorrect because intersex people exist and they're about as common as people with red hair. I get it though, most of us have been taught that if you have XX chromosomes you're a woman, and if you have XY chromosomes you're a man. But what about people who only have one X chromosome, or people who have XXY chromosomes, or people who have XY chromosomes but they have androgen insensitivity syndrome so their body develops as a woman? This isn't a video on intersex identities. I don't think I'm intersex, so I'm going to stay in my lane here. But the thing is, we know scientifically that there are more than just male bodies and female bodies, so why do we believe that there are just male brains and female brains? We're complex. There are more than two ways to be human, and I think that's something we should celebrate, not fear. And that brings us to non-binary identities, which is a catch-all term for anyone who doesn't 100% identify as male or female. One thing I want to stress here is that this is not talking about gender roles or gender stereotypes. I think one of the things that people get wrong most often about non-binary people is that non-binary people identify as non-binary because they don't want to adhere to certain gender roles or gender stereotypes. But there's a big difference between someone who's gender non-conforming, which is someone who says screw gender roles, I'm gonna do what I want, and someone who's non-binary who, based on their internal sense of self, their internal sense of identity, they don't fit 100% in the boxes male or female. Like, if a man wears makeup and a dress every single day of his life, but he 100% identifies as a man, then he is a man. Likewise, if a non-binary person wears makeup and a dress every single day, but they identify as non-binary, they are non-binary. Because gender expression is external, but gender identity is internal. I know that non-binary identities can be a bit confusing at first because most of us grew up in a world where we didn't know that non-binary people existed, so hopefully I've explained that in a way that makes sense. So the first non-binary identity I want to talk about in this video is actually non-binary. Now, non-binary is an umbrella term for all of the identities I'm going to be talking about in this video, but it's also a standalone identity in and of itself. So you can walk up to someone and say, "Hi, I'm non-binary," or "Hi, I'm an NB." Get it? NB? And that's the identity in and of itself. And like I said before, this means that this person doesn't exclusively identify as male or female. So some non-binary people, instead of using he, him pronouns or she, her pronouns, will use they, them pronouns, such as, "Oh, someone left their phone here. I hope they come back and get it." It can be a little bit difficult at first, but I promise you with practice, it's totally doable. Now you may be wondering why I keep saying things like exclusively male or female or 100% male or female. And the reason for that is because there are a number of non-binary identities that may identify in part with one or both of the binary genders, but not entirely. A perfect example of this is someone who's gender fluid, meaning that their gender identity and their internal sense of self changes over time. Most often these people may feel more masculine on some days and more feminine on others, but you can also oscillate between a binary identity and a non-binary identity, or even two non-binary identities. And there are also people who identify as gender flux, where it isn't necessarily the person's gender identity that changes over time, but the extent to which they feel connected to that static gender identity. The next identities that we have on our list are essentially a match set, demi-girl and demi-boy. So let's say that gender is on a spectrum from 1 to 10, with 1 being 100% male and 10 being 100% female. A demi-girl is someone who might say, "I'm a 7 or an 8 or maybe even a 9, but I don't really feel that 100% identification as a 10, as being 100% female." And on the other side, a demi-boy is someone who says, "Well, I'm kind of a 2 or a 3 or a 4, but I'm not that 1. Normally demi-girls are people who are assigned male at birth and demi-boys are people who are assigned female at birth, but this doesn't have to be the case. The bottom line is that demi-girls partially but not entirely identify as women, and demi-boys partially but not entirely identify as men. And again, this has absolutely nothing to do with gender roles or gender stereotypes and everything to do with gender identity. If a man wears a dress and makeup every single day, but identifies 100% as being a man, he's still a 1. And it's the same with, you know, drag kings and butch lesbians and tomboys on the other end of the spectrum. Lastly, there is one more gender identity under the demigender category, and that is demi-NB or demi-non-binary, which is someone who partially but not entirely identifies with a non-binary identity. And actually, this is one that kind of confuses me personally, I'll be willing to admit that, just because the way I logically work through it, I'm like, okay, so if you identify partially with a binary identity, then you would also partially identify with a non-binary identity automatically. So I see a lot of overlap between demi-NB and demi-non-binary and demi-boy or demi-girl. So I'm not sure how demi-non-binary stands as its own identity, just because it seems really similar to demi-girl and demi-boy. But just because it confuses me doesn't mean it's not valid. Just because something is confusing doesn't mean it's not completely valid and worthy of respect. So I wanted to make sure that demi-NBs are included on this list, and I also wanted to invite you to comment down below and educate me, because it's something that confuses me and it's something that I want to understand better. The last gender identities I can think of which fall under the umbrella of partially but not entirely identifying with a binary gender are bigender and trigender, which, as you might be able to guess from the word, bigender means you identify with 2 genders and trigender means that you identify with 3. I think if you identify with more than 3, the label is polygender, and I've heard some people identify as pangender, meaning that they identify with all genders, but this is widely considered to be inappropriate because there are some gender identities which are inextricably linked to certain cultures, such as the Hijras of Indian culture and the Two-Spirit people of certain Native American cultures. So claiming those identities without belonging to those cultures is considered disrespectful. And if you're wondering what the difference is between someone who is bigender or trigender or polygender and someone who's gender fluid, I'm pretty sure it's that when you're bigender or trigender or polygender, you experience all of those gender identities simultaneously. So for example, someone who is gender fluid might say sometimes I feel like a man and sometimes I feel like a woman, whereas someone who's bigender might say I feel like a man and a woman simultaneously at the same time. Please do correct me in the comments if I'm wrong about that one, because it's not a label that applies to me, so this is just me going off of what I've read and what I've heard from other people who identify as such. Okay, just 3 more identities to go. The next identity on the list is androgyne, which is someone who falls right in the middle of the gender spectrum. So using our analogy from before where 1 is male and 10 is female, an androgyne might identify as a 5 or a 6, right there in the middle. And now I move on to the last 2 identities on the list, which consists of people who don't really fit on the gender spectrum at all. The word genderqueer refers to people who don't identify as male or female, and this obviously sounds a lot like the term non-binary, and the two have been used interchangeably for a long time by the community. But the way I understand the difference is that someone who is non-binary is just anyone who doesn't identify 100% as male or female, whereas someone who is genderqueer does not identify as male or female at all. They don't identify with either. There's something else completely separate, completely on their own, something completely unique. And I've also heard the terms aporagender and maverick used to describe this sort of identity, but I think that genderqueer is more common in the LGBT community. And last but certainly not least, we have agender, which encompasses people who have no internal sense of gender identity. So whereas an androgyne might say, I'm not a man or a woman, I'm right in the middle, and a genderqueer person might say, I'm not a man or a woman, I'm something else entirely. An agender person would say, I'm not a man or a woman, I'm just me. I don't really have that internal sense of having a gender identity. The term agender can also encompass people who are apathetic about their gender or choose not to identify their gender, but the key thing here is that when it comes to gender, most agender people would prefer to do without. If you're someone who's questioning your gender, I think one of the best ways to go about doing so is to ask yourself some hypothetical questions and gauge your reaction. For example, you might ask yourself, how would I feel if I woke up in the body of the other binary gender? For a lot of cis people, their reaction would be one of revulsion, whereas for a lot of trans people, a lot of binary trans people, their reaction would be, oh, well, that's a dream come true. But if your answer is a bit more nuanced than that, then it might be worth asking yourself even more hypothetical questions, such as, well, does my sense of gender identity change over time? Or how would I express my gender if I were the only person on Earth? Keep asking questions and see where the rabbit hole leads you. And remember, it's okay if your labels change over time. As we change and discover ourselves, it's okay if our labels change to fit that. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, be sure to share it with someone else who might find it helpful as well. And also while you're at it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content just like this. Remember that you're wonderful, and that the world is a better place because you're in it. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video. Bye!